There we go. So, welcome everybody to the Owing Up to the Urban Lecture Series 2023. This is hosted by the Master of Urban Design degrees at the University of Michigan and the University of Virginia. And today we are excited and honored to have Benjamin Stokes with us. We are Maria Arquero de Alarcón from Michigan and my colleague
Mona Al-Kafi from the UVA School of Architecture. And as a brief introduction, this semester, we are specifically interested in featuring novel organizational infrastructures in which the design disciplines strategize on experimental approaches to address the urban complexity and uncertainty, often embedded in the context of academic institutions, nonprofit organizations, or larger professional firms. The lab, the center, or the cluster of productive configurations where clusters of productive configurations where research and design methodologies can be experimented with, challenged, and innovated.
Through this lecture series, we are examining the formation of these organizational units, their actors and their operational logics, and the work that is emerging from them. Our guests will discuss their projects' temporal and spatial scales, access to funding and resources, the strategies for engaging diverse publics, and the experiences to advance co-production.
As a part of their presentations, our guest speakers will reflect on a series of questions that we addressed in advance that are dealing with agency, methods, actors, actions, funding, and also potential replication. And with this, I'm handing it over to our student moderators who are going to introduce our speaker tonight.
So tonight we have Benjamin Stokes. He is a civic media scholar, game designer, and director of the Playful City Lab. He's also an assistant professor in the School of Communication and at the AU Game Center. Previously, he co-founded Games for Change, the movement hub for advancing social change with games. At the MacArthur Foundation, prior to academia, Benjamin was a program officer in their portfolio on digital media and learning. Benjamin has also worked at the UC Berkeley School of Information as a postdoctoral scholar in data science. His design experience in the civic realm includes leading teams at NetAid and Mercy Corp in global citizenship education.
Ben's research investigates civic media, community engagement, and neighborhood empowerment through strengthening neighborhoods with real-world games, participatory design, and impact with games. He leads the Playful City Lab, where he advances strategies for participation and engagement shaping the future of cities. The lab investigates the power of playful tactics to advance equity, strengthen the sense of place, and build strong communities. His new book, Locally Played, Real-World Games for Stronger Places and Communities, provides game designers with a model to strengthen existing networks tied to place and give city leaders tools to look past technology trends in order to make a difference in the real world. So with that, thanks so much for joining us tonight, Ben. We will now hand over the power to you to begin screen sharing whenever you're ready.
All right, great. Let's see if we can pull this up and turn it over to slides. Is that looking all right to folks? Great. Well, hello and welcome. It's great to be joining you. I'm going to be talking a little today about play and game design and why this is actually a surprisingly powerful perspective for design in urban planning, and especially as our cities become increasingly digital places. I think that the physical and the digital are coming together, and the most advanced form of thinking about interactive design comes from games. So if you want to be part of the future about thinking about what's the future of cities, I think that game design is a really interesting place to look for from your models. And what I'm going to argue today is that it's not just in the future, but some of it is already here. In fact, I'm going to show you a few surprising uses of play that are in our cities, how cities already have play as part of them, and how play can lead to greater cohesion, partly in opposition to something called gamification, which a number of you may have heard about. And I'm not super huge as a fan of gamification, which is often the simplistic adding of just points and badges and leaderboards. That is not the same as games and play. It's borrowing, I think, kind of cheaply from the deeper principles. And I think that if you all are interested in really borrowing from some of the lens of play and engagement, we have to go deeper than gamification. This will also be a talk that provides a few principles of play so that you can use these principles in your other work. And this is not just about designing digital things. I would actually argue that some of the principles for game design, or as I sometimes call it, game design thinking, some of the thinking of game design can be applied in all sorts of design projects, whether the project is for a bit of public space, whether the project is for a building, and especially as public space and buildings become more interactive, as we have a digital layer to our cities, places, and communities. So I wanted to start with what probably is what most of us think of as games in cities. If I say, think about games coming to cities, I bet a lot of you think of things like this. This is an image of a smartphone, of course, with a backdrop that feels physical and real, and maybe you're moving around physical space. This is a game that is called Dow Day, and it's an educational game where you move around to different physical places. Each place you go to unlocks new bits of video, and you have conversations with different people that were historically tied to that place. And I think that that's a legitimate form. Sure, that counts, but I'm just giving that half credit if you want to have a broad notion. Because there's so many more ways in which games and game design thinking intersect with our cities. And I'm going to emphasize the other half beyond what you might have thought about with apps in this talk. Even in some ways to think of our cities and the buildings that they are as being potential places for games as well. Here is a skyscraper in Philadelphia with a 29-story game display. This was the first Pong in 2013, and then Tetris that made it into the Guinness Book of World Records for the largest architectural video game display. Frank Lee was the creator. So if you're wondering how our cities might host games, here is a very literal way. But I think that both the prior example and this one rely a little too heavily on what I might call digital game culture. That in fact, there are many ways in which games and play intersect with our cities that don't have a lot to do visually with video games. Let me show you another example. Here is a project, the Crown Fountain in Chicago. Some of you may have encountered this project before. I think it's a lot of fun. Here on this giant fountain sculpture, it's really just kind of a big block, but it's video. The face that you see here might be kind of still, the eyes might open, a different person might appear, but the water is often coming out of the mouth. And the interesting thing that you see here is that I think in the people that are in front of it, it's very easy for us to pay too much attention to the designed object, but play and games are about participation fundamentally. A game is something that you participate in and you voluntarily choose to participate in. When we start assigning games, telling people they have to play games, they often stop being games at all. And that's an interesting paradox of what games and play can mean that I'll be talking a little about later. This, of course, is a very expensive project. This was a $17 million construction and design project. And I think that cities are investing in these, and some of you might come up with design projects like this for cities. I think this is a very powerful example of how we can bring play into our public spaces. What do I mean by games and play? Two principles I want to start discussing here that I'll come around to in different ways. First, that games have playful challenges, and second, that they have uncertain outcomes. Let me tell you a little what I mean by those things. Playful is in some ways the spirit that comes around games and play. And if you look at especially the children in this picture, being playful in the water, running in and out, that's a spirit that we try to evoke. Why does that spirit matter? Well, one of the reasons is that in public space, if we want some of the incredible benefits of having people mix across older residents and younger residents, Black residents, Latino residents, men, women, all that kind of mixing that happens in public space that is so important, we need to create the room for that. And play, I might argue, is often the most powerful way to create new space, to open up room between people for them to come together and interact in new ways. And it's often easiest to see with young people, but it can also happen with older people. Play is not limited to young people. In fact, if you've ever been to a sports stadium, which of course probably most of you have, they are often oriented towards adults, right? So there are some funny things with play and games that have historically been blind to the world of urban planners and designers, because play is one of these things that we're not supposed to talk about too directly. We have often talked about play as a thing for kids, even when it's actually a thing for all ages. We have often talked about play as something that we only study in other countries. A crazy thing in the history of play is that for a long time, anthropologists and scholars of play only studied play in other countries when studying foreign people. A really crazy, short-sighted perspective. And it's only been fairly recently that we have started to legitimize the study of play in the United States. I was one of the first people to be able to get a PhD with a focus on games and play, and it is now a much more common practice. In fact, there are now more than 300 degree programs in the United States that give degrees in game design. So there are hundreds and hundreds of places in the US that are now giving degrees and certificates in game design, and that didn't exist at all, or almost not at all 10 years ago. So there's a pretty radical transformation happening in higher education, and I think it speaks to the future of planning as well. Planning departments are frankly behind on this. If you go and talk to urban planning departments, most of them will say, and you ask them, are you hiring game designers? They'll say, what? We don't hire game designers, right? But I would predict that if you go 10 years in the future, they will definitely be thinking about game design as a thing that they should be hiring for. Not for every position, but for certain key, it's a specialty. It'll be a specialty that will then cut across a whole bunch of design parameters. The playfulness is a part of this picture. The challenge is a second part, that play, when it is at the appropriate level of difficulty, is often where games happen. What do we call a game that is too easy? Boring, right? What do we call a game that is too hard? Frustrating. And this amazing ability to balance between too easy and too hard is something that games do incredibly well. And I would argue it's often the essence of what we really want to be doing with our public engagement experiences. When we want to pace for the right level of difficulty, games are the discipline that has done that the longest and the best. The design practice of designing games is where we get some of that difficulty balancing. And finally, this uncertain outcome. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with a game. As soon as you can tell me exactly what's going to happen, it stops being very interesting. And this is true whether the game we're talking about is chess or ping pong, whether it's Call of Duty, a digital game, or even Animal Crossing, right? As soon as you can tell me exactly what's going to happen, it becomes totally boring. And this is one of the key differences from a lot of educational games are poorly designed, because you can tell them exactly what the right answer is. You bring in an adult is supposed to build, I know exactly how this goes, but that's actually a bad game design. So this is one of the benefits of those of you that have played a bunch of games. You might be actually better at this than some of the early game designers in non-serious spaces, game designers in education, game designers for health, game designers for public purpose, and certainly urban game design as well, has struggled sometimes from forgetting this core principle that we need the outcome to remain uncertain. So I would argue that if you wanted to take away two things from this talk, keep looking for when can we be playful, when do we offer deliberate challenges, and when do we want the outcome to be uncertain? When are those positive things for what we're looking for? They don't always look visual. I offer this because this has a digital media component, but sometimes the digital component can be a little bit hidden, and it can also come in cities that you might not expect. Here's an example called Mapaton, a 2015 game in Mexico City. And here the challenge was that Mexico City has a transportation system with a huge number of riders, 14 million rides a day, but they've done it in a funny partnership with private companies that can actually start their own informal bus routes in order to solve a gap, which is kind of amazing, kind of cool that this emerging system can happen. But the downside is that the city centrally doesn't actually know all of its own bus routes. They're actually just happening on their own. Well, the city did want to be able to map them to some extent, because you can't do things like recommend a transit route to someone if you don't know where the buses are and when they're running. So the digital and the existing emergent system had to start connecting in some way. And this was, they created a game that was a mapping game to be played on a phone for mapping the different routes around the city. The interesting thing is that it mapped the richer neighborhoods first. So there was an equity problem that started popping up very quickly because the richer neighborhoods had more people with smartphones who were mapping them. But the interesting thing with games is that they have feedback loops. And these feedback loops can let us balance for some of the inequities that almost always come with digital systems. Those of you who have been studying digital systems know that just like physical systems, inequality is often baked into the structures of our design processes and our architecture. And when you start seeing how the digital and physical come together in our cities, we have to always be thinking about how can we counterbalance the fact that we tend to give more infrastructure to richer neighborhoods and make the rich richer and the poor poorer. Well, in this particular game, one way that they balanced for that was they started giving more points for if you were mapping a route in a poorer neighborhood. And what this led to was that the players with smartphones from the richer neighborhoods started traveling to poorer neighborhoods in order to map them. And it was a pretty minor modification of the feedback system, just shifting where the points were, that led to the data system being structurally much more equal. It's a minor adjustment in some way, but I would argue it's an adjustment that is often missing from approaches to digital technology like 311 systems. Oh, anyone can report a pothole. Anybody can suggest where there should be public art or put up a mural. A lot of these systems take the city approach of we'll do the same thing everywhere, and that will be fair. Well, it might be fair from a certain perspective, but it's not necessarily oriented towards justice and equity. And I think for those of us thinking about justice and equity, games provide an interesting model for how we can actually be more equal by using the feedback loops of games. I wanted just to summarize some of these principles by offering you a little definition for game-based activities. And I'm deliberately not saying this is a formal game, because I think a lot of what you all might make and do with games might not be technically a game. It's fine if it has some of the principles of games, but you should know what games do well. And this is a definition that I use in the book, which, by the way, thank you all for those of you who have the book image as your backdrop. I think that's fun. I appreciate that. In my book, I propose this is a useful definition for people working in cities because it emphasizes what games can do differently than a lot of our other design tools. So we structure participation with games, because games are participatory. We structure participation first through playful challenges, second through feedback loops. Again, what neighborhood do we send people to, for example? And third, through uncertain outcomes. Those are kind of the essential elements of game design. And I would argue that this is a general model that you can take to many of your design challenges and ask, when do I want to do something that has some of the benefits of games, and how can I use these principles? You'll note none of these three say you need points, you need badges, you need leaderboards, you need competition, because a lot of those things that we think of as game attributes are actually less important than these more fundamental properties. And in fact, you'll find exceptions to what you think of as a game as soon as you start looking. The future of cities has all sorts of fun things that can look like interactivity. I wanted to just offer another piece or two. You may have seen some of these fun examples in other places. Here's another example from Mexico City. This is a set of fountain jets, 17 jets in a circle here, and they're each independently controlled. So at some level, architecturally, this isn't that interesting. It just looks like a circle. But the cool thing is, because the water can be interactive, you can turn off and on each jet. And in this interesting experiment, what they did was they brought out these pads. These are pressure pads that when you jump on it, it's effectively like turning on a button. And they invited the public, or they especially focused on young people, to program the jets, left, right, go for this forward, then this jet, just using these pads. So there were no monitors, no digital displays. But it's inviting participation in the city, and it's inviting people to have some control over the even something as seemingly fundamental as the flow of water, which we think of as a decision that the ordinary person doesn't get to adjust the flow of water. That's for a city engineer. And yet here, this project opened up that space as a space for possibility, a space where the digital and the physical can interact. And I think that this is some of what we're going to see in the future of our cities, things that don't necessarily look like digital things in the first place, or even necessarily like games, but they can draw on the principles of games at the intersection of the physical and the digital. I have two principles that I try to follow in my work. First, I look for games and play that is embedded in public space, or embedded in institutions like libraries, or sometimes even embedded with urban furniture. What does a bus stop look like? Whether that's the bench being interactive, a screen behind it, or something like a newspaper box that has some interactivity with it. So embedding, though, is a principle that I often look for with the games that I study and analyze. And second, I'm really interested in how games can strengthen a place, make a place stronger, leave it more cohesive than when you found it. What does it mean to strengthen a place? You all have probably been looking at this through other readings and other things you've been looking into, but I'll just mention a couple ways. One way that a place can be stronger is if it has a strong local identity. We are Chicago. People will rally around that identity. People will shift policy around that identity. People will come out and protest to defend a place that they care about if it has that kind of identity. We can also make places stronger by improving business connections. And there have been a number of games that have shifted the economy, that have shifted which businesses get attention. Can we direct through gameplay traffic to mom and pop stores, to locally owned businesses, to goods that have been produced in the area? So changing the business climate or even affecting actual flows of money can be another way we strengthen place. And I can talk about games that have done that. And I think a third one just to mention is that if we know our history in a place, I think we're also stronger. That's a kind of civic history notion that, of course, I think architecture often brings in. You don't just build a building without having thought at all about what was there before. Of course, you would do that with a building, but we often forget about that when the digital comes in. And suddenly we're building a game or an app with no sense of history. So I would argue the sense of history, in the same way we bring that to our building design, can increasingly be brought to game design as well. Okay, I'm going to offer another example or two. Let me jump to San Jose, California. This is a map of San Jose at the top left. And those of you who have played the game Pokemon Go, which probably is a number of you, at the bottom right. This was a project that was an experiment with how we can remix and embed, there's that word again, embedding the game into place. Can we embed Pokemon Go in an activation for a city. And I flew out to San Jose in 2018 to understand this project and what was being done. They actually already had an existing event there that was called an open street style event called Viva Calle. Here is a picture of this event. So a lot of people come out. It might be on a particular day. There's a route through the city, and you can see at the top a map where people start. They go along, they move from one neighborhood to another. Why does the city do something like this? Well, they want to reimagine public space, to think about the streets when they're closed to cars. Can that suddenly become a park that we imagine our city in a different way? Try biking in a place that you would never have biked before because there were too many cars previously, but you bike and suddenly you think, oh, that's amazing. We have to have bike lanes. Let's change our bike architecture and infrastructure. Okay, that's what they already had. How does this tie into Pokemon Go? Well, what they said was, in addition to having biking and walking and rollerblading, well, you can also come do Pokemon Go here. And we're going to structurally support that, not just make it something that people do anyways. Right away, the players started remixing that space with their notions of the game. So here's a game map at the bottom right, where players took the same route, but showed where you could get particular Pokemon characters, where there were particular nests or concentrations of Pokemon, and why you might want to deviate from the route. In other words, the geography of the place, actually, it turned out already had another layer on top of it, where there were persistent scarcities and beneficial areas to visit in terms of the Pokemon Go game. And this led to already some interesting rethinking about how does the existing geography map onto the game geography. The two were overlapping in many ways. And the players, to come back to this, what first seems like the complexity of the city means there's so much going on here. What did the players do? Well, there were 35,000 players that came. There were already 100,000, but 35,000 additional people came playing Pokemon Go. And the study that San Jose led and that I supported found that they brought almost $500,000 into the local economy on that one day, just in terms of their spending. So it's a fairly significant outlay of funds into restaurants and local businesses while they were visiting. But the interesting thing is that it also changed some of the kinds of participation in the event. Historically, San Jose had struggled with the event being much more of an attraction for white and particularly Latino groups, and they hadn't had as much of an Asian population as they'd wanted. Well, an interesting thing, when they added Pokemon Go, they were able to shift some of the demographics and have the attendance for the event match the actual residential demographics in terms of race and gender. So this is, I think, a really interesting idea that long-term, something that a transit department or city activation might be doing is balancing events with things that are partly physical. Oh yes, you can come and bike, but you can also play Pokemon Go. And they might choose a pairing of the physical and the digital in order to get the right kind of demographic mix that they're looking for in their cities. I think that this is still just on the cusp of what planning departments are starting to do. Planning and transit departments still mostly think in terms of, well, should we have bikers and walkers? Like for a lot of them, that's as much as they can think about. But the advanced planning departments are starting to think, should we have bikers, walkers, and something digital? And what will that digital activity be? There are going to be an increasing number of those activities. And I think that those of us that can start to think in the digital and physical ways will have a kind of advantage going in. At the same time, I think that we shouldn't presume that digital things are an automatic solution. They don't solve all of our problems by any means. Here's an interesting example with Pokemon Go. This is a project with young people in Boston to take some of the game and add content to the game. What you see with the Pokemon Go screenshot inset here is a little of what it used to look like in the game if you visited this mural. In the back, you can see this kind of amazing mural which is known as the Faces of Dudley. But the challenge is that if you visit it in the game, there's hardly a description at all, and a kind of blurry picture. You are not actually going to find out that much about the local place and its history and its cultural assets. And so a group of students came together in Boston to think about writing the copy. Who gets to write the copy that's in this game? Because that actually has a pretty significant influence. Thousands and thousands of people can look at the content that's in a game like Pokemon Go. It's in some ways similar to asking who gets to write the little plaques, right? That are might be mounted in a lawn, describing what neighborhood you're in or what is some of the history of that neighborhood. And this group of young people was actually very motivated to write the content for this game. Here's a little bit of a contrast. Very just in some ways, it's a small lift to shift from just giving the date to say the Faces of Dudley, this locally famous mural created in 1995 was remodeled in 2015 to include more women. So they actually are giving a little bit of history that's very empowering for the community, where they said, we were able to improve this mural, come together as people and say, we would like to have more women in this mural. And that history was added into the descriptions in the game as well. The interesting reason why I bring this up, though, is not just because games are a place where we have contested texts and we think about who gets to have the power to write and change that text, but also to come back to this question of games as a motivating force. When this project was first brought to young people in Boston, a bunch of the adults running the project thought, oh, young people, they're of course going to want to do Pokemon Go. And they were shocked to discover that actually a whole lot of them had very little interest in playing Pokemon Go. Oh, I tried that once. Oh, I'm not a big Pokemon Go player. But as soon as they changed the question from, do you want to play Pokemon Go and possibly edit the game, to instead foreground the editing, to say, do you want to edit the text so that thousands of people could see a description of your neighborhood in a new way? Suddenly, it was actually a much more popular program. And I say this because too often we think that games themselves are motivating. If we just call it a game, people will sign up. Young people especially will sign up if it's a game. And I ask you, well, then how come everyone doesn't play basketball? Well, some people like football, some people like ping pong, and a lot of people like video games. And what we're starting to see is that preferences for games are actually hugely specific to the kinds of genres that people play, to their friends, what their friends play, and what they're playing right then at that moment. Yes, they may have played Pokemon Go at a certain time, but that doesn't mean they're playing it right now. By the way, probably some of you know this, Pokemon Go is not gone. Some people are like, Pokemon Go, it's old, right? Actually, Pokemon Go remains incredibly profitable. It's making huge amounts of money. There's a core player base that continues to play Pokemon Go. It's not in the news stories as much. We're not hearing as much about it in the press, but it remains a hugely powerful force for a certain population. And I think that this is kind of the future of games. We're not necessarily going to have any magic games that everyone plays, any more than suddenly we're going to have everyone go bowling or everyone play ping pong. At best, you'll get some of the population. And perhaps if you win a national championship, you might get a bunch of people turning out for a parade. But we are going to continue to have different people liking different games. And I think that that's fine. That's, in fact, part of living in a society that has a cultural richness. We're going to have lots of different ways to play. The interesting thing to me is that it can be more universal as a motivating force to edit the content for a game than to actually play any one game. It can be highly motivating to think, I could change the content and reach millions of players who might play Pokemon Go in Boston. That might actually have a wider appeal than actually saying you get to play Pokemon Go. And this is in some ways a paradox because we think of games as having this magic of engagement, and they do, but sometimes it is actually more universal to think of the magic as being getting that kind of audience, getting that kind of attention, and affecting how people understand our neighborhoods. So in the book, I talk about some different ways that games can make communities stronger. And I had hinted about that earlier. I wanted to come back to that question and offer you 4 big models for how games and play can make communities and neighborhoods stronger. And I think that these could be useful to you in your future design work. First, games are powerful because they can help build social ties. How would we measure this? Well, we can measure it in terms of human networks. Some of you may have heard of social capital, for example, the idea that we can talk about whether somebody knows a lot of neighbors and could turn to them, for example, and say, I want to borrow, I need a cup of sugar for a recipe. Do you know enough people where you could ask them that question? Would they loan you a cup of sugar if you need it in a short period of time? Games, because they open up space for people to talk and meet their neighbors, can actually be a way that they can contribute to building social capital. So we could measure the success of a game project, not in terms of whether it educates people, that may or may not be what the game's goal is, but whether it connects people. Have you met people through playing this? And certainly with Pokemon Go, some of my research on Pokemon Go showed very clearly that the players, the big effect was not that they learned something about Pokemon. No, I mean, they might have, but who cares? I don't particularly care about Pokemon content personally, but they met a lot of people in their neighborhood. Or they had a connection with a young person that they regularly went out and played with on Saturdays. So the outcome is a matter of social capital. Second, that they can be a way to connect to the group, so that by playing, we strengthen our sense of shared identity, our sense of shared beliefs, and even our sense of place. In other words, games could be part of placemaking strategies. If by virtue of playing, we uncover some of what this place used to be or what it means to us collectively. Just a quick example to stick with Pokemon Go. Here is a project in Philadelphia where Pokemon Go was used by libraries to create what they called Poke Crawls. You start at the library, you walk around a couple different blocks, and then you come back to the library. Very simple. But Pokemon Go players would come and walk this path. There would be, sometimes there would be incentives in the game, but sometimes it was also just an excuse to combine the game with getting to know your neighborhood a little better. What you see at the right are some of the famous murals. Philadelphia is famous as a city of murals. It's a point of pride for them. It's rooted in a lot of their placemaking efforts, have murals as part of that. And reinforcing this identity of Philadelphia as a city of murals is something that could be done by offering this kind of poke crawl experience. For games, the model here, the genre, I think of as almost the tour, right? Thinking about tours as something that cities do, history tours, walking tours, bike tours, all kinds of tours happen in cities. And that these tours are often ways of experiencing place, opening our eyes up to what's around us, and that they can be tied in with games as much as they can be tied in with other things as well. Walking tours and bike tours are established. What does it mean to have a game-based tour? This is something that's emerging. It's happened in some cities around Pokemon Go. It's only going to grow. And I think the cities that can experiment with this earlier by thinking creatively about this will be able to be known as leaders, as pioneers in some of these approaches to bringing games in alongside other forms of tours. Let me offer another kind of community strength. A third kind is that games can also amplify organizations. So if we think of strong places, strong neighborhoods as having a group life, they have, sometimes it might be a civic association, it might be a nonprofit, it might be a church group. But this has been a long tenet of at least American democracy, that associations are part of how we measure the strength of a community. And that these groups are often informal. They aren't always registered 501c3 organizations, but that when games can connect back and affirm those groups, then they can strengthen the community in place. I offer this at the same time with a caution, because there are also games that do the opposite of this, that forget about existing organizations and instead are just for players. And there's no role for city government. There's no role for church groups. There's no role for nonprofits. And I think that this actually can weaken the community, even the game may seem to be about the community, but if it undercuts and undermines and hides the value of the organizations that are strengthening and defending that community, then I think it actually can weaken the community. And this is a warning that if we make games that are just for users, it's kind of like designing cities that are just for citizens, but don't have any of the structure of civic life. And if anyone has ever tried to organize something like a community protest, you know that organizations are what make those things work. Organizations are what can rally a whole bunch of people and say, here's this structure, here's what we're going to do together, here's what our demands are. Yes, maybe without an organization, you could get a bunch of people out, but it almost never leads to anything. It's just chaos in the streets, right? Organizations are how we turn things into some sort of structure, a sense of agenda, raise money, build a list of people that you can contact. So I think that this is an important aspect of community life that games can tie into as well. Let me show another game example just to keep testing our limits of what games can be. This is a game called Reactivism that was about surfacing community history. And it was played, here it's being played in New York City. And this player has to go to a particular location. And this is a location of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And those of you, some may be familiar with this. It's a famous fire that happened where before there were a lot of good fire codes. And it was around sweatshop workers in New York City. And because they had some of the fire doors locked, physically locked to keep workers in and working, a bunch of people died. In fact, jumped out of windows that didn't have to. It's a terrible tragedy, but a lot of people in New York walk by the place of the shirtwaist factory fire and never realize that it was located right there. So in the game, you go to places of historical importance and you do things that try to make those places visible, including with chalk or by having stories with other or performance with other players. Here's a version of the game that was played in Atlanta, which around some of the history of civil rights. A key march had happened at a certain place, and so players in the game reenacted part of the march. And when passerby said, "What are you doing here?" "Oh, well, we only get points in this game if we reenact a bit of history." So I wanted to offer this as another contrast for what games can be. Sometimes they are driven largely by rules that are social and performances that are very temporary. They don't need a physical object or installation at all. And yet they can be coordinated digitally. A fun version of this game was that at each of the locations, people took pictures of their actions and protests, and they sent it into the site. And these were then visible to those who were not playing the game. So online, you could get a sense of what were people playing and learn about your city and some of the media that they were creating. Increasingly, we're recognizing that our cities are mediated places where we get our stories from digital media. What's the history of this place? Well, what was on TikTok about this place? What are people talking about? And so the idea that the game should translate and reflect itself back on a place like TikTok or Instagram, I think is an open question. And it's something that our game designers are increasingly thinking about as well. That's the fourth road to community strength that I wanted to mention, that games can help bridge flows of news and information. They can help connect something like social media to play that's physical, or even to an experience that's tied to a town square. As we're designing physical architecture, increasingly we have to think about, how is this going to translate into social media? How is the storytelling that's going to happen in social media about this place going to work productively to amplify and strengthen the sense of place rather than to have the digital distract or head in a different direction? And I want to mention one last project that I've been working on most recently. That's a fun one, not in the book, but it's an experiment in 60 plus cities to ask, how can libraries design their own games? Because quite often the only open civic institution at the neighborhood level is the public library. A lot of neighborhoods don't have their own museum, but they might have their own library. And so we got a grant to help 60 plus cities all make games in community libraries. And these games are often pretty low tech. We start off our prototyping often with cards and thinking about, how do we tell branching stories? But sometimes then they tie into things like sculptures. At top right, or here's a zoomed in picture of it, is a game that we made with our game engine called Hive Mechanic. That's our game engine. And this is a 50-foot sculpture. And we have a 5-year installation with this sculpture, where if you look down at the base, you can see this sign at the bottom. Let me zoom in on the sign. It says, "This sculpture talks back." And so it invites passersby to scan the QR code and interact with the sculpture. If you wanted to try it now, you're welcome to. It's a demo version of the project. The actual one, you have to go to Reston, Virginia, which is where it is installed. I'm not using their actual QR code, so they can, I don't want to charge them for it. Each text message is relatively cheap, though. It's under a penny every time we send or receive a text message, which means if we think about this as infrastructure, right, there is some ongoing infrastructure costs to having a sculpture that is both physically present and digitally present. But it's also pretty cheap, relatively speaking. The cost of adding in this digital layer is not high. And what you'll find if you interact with it is the sculpture will tell you some of how it was made and its history. But it can also tell you about some of the female artists in the community. This was a project that was done by a female sculptor who wanted to, in the surrealist tradition, reveal some of the hidden history of women in the surrealist movement and of local female artists as something that more people who live in the neighborhood should learn about. So I think that sometimes the games can be right in front of us and can be relatively low cost. Even as we're thinking about a physical installation, the digital can be part of that design at a low cost or at a much more invested project like we saw in Chicago. So that's in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap there and just thank you all for listening a little to some of the ideas around play and game design. I really do think that games are a really different way of thinking about design and play that centers engagement, centers participation, and may be one of the most powerful ways we can bring the digital and the physical together. Thank you.
Hi, Ben. My name is Mia. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us in this really fascinating talk. We're going to transition to our Q&A, but while I give my colleagues a little bit of time to formulate comments and questions, we have a few initial prompts we'd love to get your insight on. The first question that we're asking all of our speakers in this lecture series is, what is the urban question that our work as designers and planners should address today with the most sense of urgency?
Yeah, I think that for me, the question of equity and participation is a kind of linked question that is urgent, whether we're thinking about the digital or the physical. That in the United States right now, we're seeing growing segregation as opposed to what we might expect. We might expect that there's less segregation, but segregation that's by class and by race, and that hasn't improved. So I'm very focused on that as an organizing issue, but I add a slightly different asterisk to it than a lot of people, which I say that the future of equity for our cities is partly digital. That if we try to address equity in purely physical terms, in terms of the built environment and in terms of policies that at first glance look like they are just about physical things like rent control, we're going to be missing that some of how rent is decided upon is through algorithms. What apartments are visible when you do a search for an apartment is increasingly determined by an algorithm. When you even drive through neighborhoods, Google Maps tells you to go this way instead of that way. So algorithms are shaping how we move through physical space. Algorithms are shaping what properties are valued and how we value them, what the dollar value is. And increasingly, our engagement is partly digital as well. So I would flag that equity is going to be a matter of physical and digital, and that the earlier we start thinking about that, the more we'll be able to address those problems as they happen, rather than try and play catch up and say, oh, for 20 years we've been experiencing a real problem, and now our cities need to course correct. So I think it's coming, and in fact, in many ways, it's already here.
Thank you.
Sorry. I'm having some trouble. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so could you tell us about your academic and professional trajectory to specialize in gaming urbanism? Because you mentioned that when you started, it wasn't a thing. And then, so to try to understand how has this changed over the years and what should current students interested in this field be doing to pursue this interest more seriously? What projects should they do, or how should they work to apply for a PhD program or things like that?
Well, I think that in some ways, the most important thing is to give yourself permission. And instead of waiting for somebody to give you a certificate, to just say, oh, I give myself permission to think a little about games and play, because it's part of all human culture, right? We don't know of a human society or culture in all of history that didn't have games and play. Every single historical project, every anthropological project has found games and play in every culture. And all of us played games as kids, right? So there's no reason we can't all own a little of that. In fact, if you've ever changed the game a little when you're playing with a dollhouse, or modified the rules when you're playing Monopoly, you've modified games, you've been a game designer. So I think at a certain level, one of my goals is to democratize the sense that all of us can be engaged in game design and play, because it's part of all of our culture already. You don't necessarily need a degree for that. And I think that the second thing is to think about principles from games that can apply, which is why I tried to offer some in my book and in this talk. And I think you can start applying those already. There's no reason that you have to get a special area of focus in that. Games as an area of design are on the digital side are profoundly interdisciplinary. So if you go into the game industry, which of course, in terms of revenue is a similar size to film, it's a massive part of our entertainment industry. You'll have people that do nothing but visual things, right? Graphics and 3D modeling. You'll have people that do nothing but narrative design. So all of those are possible paths. But the kind of things we need for cities is not actually to specialize in any one of those, but to keep looking across disciplines and areas. I started making games as a kid, and I made them just kind of for fun at different times as an adult. In some ways, I got into them more as a researcher first, professionally. And then I thought, well, why don't I make things as I go? And so when I was in graduate school, I started entering more games into game festivals as well. So there's a growing independent game scene. Board games, of course, are also huge. Games are not just the digital, and board games are selling very well right now. There's lots of interesting games, and including card games for urban folks to think about the built environment, and even to think about histories of things like living cities in the 1970s. And how our country has tried different experiments in playful role play at the city level by having the chief of police come into a gym and role play that they are instead the head of schools. So there have been lots of histories of games and play that you can do that don't necessarily require digital skills. Of course, if you want a certificate in game design, I'm happy to say that I work at a university that does offer these. You can come and get an MA or MFA in game design at my university or a bunch of other places. But I don't think that necessarily is the only way to add it. Again, you can add it into what you're currently doing as well.
Thank you for such an insightful talk. So we have another question. So in your opinion, what role does playfulness and play in creating effective games for the community? And how can game designers balance the need for fun and engagement with the serious objectives of urban development in community building?
That's a great question. And often the answer is that it's a balance. And if you think about something like an icebreaker, for example, at the start of a very serious meeting, you can still have a very serious conversation that comes after you've done an icebreaker. And what is an icebreaker useful for? Icebreakers often are opening that playful space, right? That space for you've talked with somebody else and you've each offered some crazy thing about how your middle name connects to a sport you once played. They get people a little bit off their usual game, and they're no longer just pitching what their solution is, saying we need rent control or we need, whatever it is. it helps people connect as humans, separate from whatever pressing issue it is. And I think that this is one of the most important things for doing good urban planning kind of work, is that we both need our very serious approaches, long-term approaches, but we also need to be making human connections, including to people that think differently than us, even the people that think somewhat opposed to us occasionally. We still need to have those human abilities to have conversations and connections. And so I think part of the answer is that it's a both at the same time. And the answer is not to turn everything into a game, because we still need serious things that are taken seriously, but it's also not to say we need to leave the play out of it and just have a very serious meeting, because you won't achieve your objectives if you take play out of both process and outcome. We need public spaces that are playful, including for poor communities. This is one of the dangers. For a while, there was a tendency, oh, we're going to build playgrounds in rich neighborhoods. And then there was a whole recognition, oh, wait, no, actually, poorer communities also need places to play and to engage. And similarly, when you're doing planning in under-resourced communities, they also might need a playful process. So I think that it's often a balance. I think of it as having a little of yes and how you do that balance is part of what can make you great at the job.
Thank you. So we have someone in the audience. Amma has raised his hand for a question. Amma, would you like to recite your question?
Hi, Professor, and thank you for sharing us a lot of game to explore the city. By thinking of another type of game that can predict the city, the future of the city. So with the development of technology, especially AI, like the GPT chat, that can we like input our policy to the city, to the AI, that it can help us analyze the policy and then output the analysis and the prediction of the result of the policy to the game. Then the game help us to know the result of our policy visually. That can help us to foresee the future of the city.
Yes, I think we can, but I would urge that we remember that playfulness is a spirit that often is left out when we start getting serious and talking about technical solutions. And so when data comes in, quite often engineers forget that their job is partly to be playful too. Models are great things to play with, but they are very dangerous if we take them too literally as predicting the right answers. And I think that if it's still very early to see where ChatGPT and other systems will go, but I would argue that the most productive version of engagement is to think of them as a playful possibility rather than the right answer. We should welcome in those playful possibilities and mixes, especially when we're thinking about futures and scenarios. But I think that they are risky to rely on as the right answer or the true answer without other additional forms of validation. And I think that we'll see where that goes. But I think if you look at some of the history of nuclear meltdown, for example, and how communities have come together to balance some of the risk, and when all the experts say, oh, it's definitely not going to melt down, and then it does. This has happened again and again with some of our engagement with nuclear energy. I think some of the same risks happen with AI, where AI says, oh, this is definitely safe, but then it may or may not be safe if we don't have ways of validating it. And I think that sense of playfulness, especially as we come in with predictive tools around data science, is something that games can help us retain.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's the negative aspect of AI.
Our second question is about, have you ever targeted a certain age in one of the games, and how are you allowing for inclusiveness, and how games are adjusting to age gaps or differences?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that games can be a way that we connect across age gaps, and sometimes public architectural type installations can be ways that both young people and old can participate. One of the ways that that happens is through the joys of watching someone else play as well, which is an interesting twist. It's not that everyone needs to play, but everyone should perhaps be able to appreciate the play and be able to make some sense of it. And I think that this is a limitation to a lot of our digital tools, is we think only of the immediate user and not the secondary observer. But when games are played in public space, they are visible to people who are not directly playing, right? When someone's playing on the playground, someone else might be watching that play on the playground. And so I think that both of those are important audiences to think about. In general, though, with games and age groups, I think that it comes down to if you put the game where a group of people are already, and this comes back to the principle of embedding. If you embed play where an audience already is, you are more likely to encourage that audience further. And so I think that that's often a place to start, and then to think about what audiences you want to bridge if you want to bring in another group. But questions of audience and inclusion are central to design, and games are no exception. So great.
Great, thank you.
I think we need to wrap up now, but thank you so much, Ben, for taking the time to speak with us and answer all our questions. It was a super fascinating talk.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben.